The picture on the PPT shows my book with the Mohenjo-daro mound, the mound of the Mohenjo-daro in the background. It's a picture that I treasure because it was sent to me on Twitter by someone who had a copy of the book from Mohenjo-daro, and this picture was taken there. And it is appropriate in many ways because it is the Harappan Civilization that started me on this project. The statuette that is on the front of the cover was recovered from Mohenjo-daro, and so in many ways it's appropriate, and it's the book that I will be drawing on, the work that was done for the book for this talk. The subject of the talk is the 4 prehistoric migrations that shaped our demography and population structure. I would like you to keep a few things in mind as we start. First of all, India, for the purpose of this talk and as in the headline of the book, is meant in the old sense of the term, as in including all of South Asia. Migrations don't respect national boundaries, so the genomic formation of South Asia is common to all of us in this region. The second is that migrations are not peculiar to India. Every large population in the world today is formed out of multiple mass migrations in prehistory, whether you're talking about the Europeans, the Americans, the Chinese, the Australians, whoever. It would be difficult for me to think of, I can't think of any large population that is not the result of multiple mass prehistoric migrations. Third thing is that while migrations happen all the time, all across the world, all of the time, there are 4 classes of migrations that really stand apart, and they stand apart for the impact they had on world demography, and they also stand apart for the fact that they were driven by historical forces, in the sense that we can today look back and understand why they happened, when they happened. These 4 classes of migrations are, the first one is the out of Africa migrations, which this is when which was driven mostly by climatic factors, as when glacial periods began or ended, as lush forests turned into deserts, modern humans as well as any other animals, they were pushed forward or pulled forward into newer regions. So this is the out of Africa migration that brought a small band of modern humans out of Africa into the Arabian Peninsula around 70,000 years ago, and that small band of people then spread all across the world, peopling all of the non-African world. The last major continent that they peopled was the Americas, and that's about 16,000 years ago. So all this we know from analyzing genomes across the world today, that all of the non-African population comes from a small subset of the African population, which got out of Africa around 70,000 years ago and then spread across. But as they were spreading, what also happened was, what intervened was also a glacial period between about 29,000 years ago and 14,000 years ago, which meant that many of these population groups got separated from each other for thousands of years, accumulating genetic differences between them in the process. The second major migration happened after the glacial period ended and the world started warming up again around 12,000 years ago, and modern humans in various parts of the world who had spread from Africa started experimenting with agriculture. And the old assumption that agriculture began in one place and spread everywhere is absolutely wrong. Agriculture began in multiple places as very different modern human population groups started experimenting with agriculture. Not all of them were successful, and even those successful were not successful to the same extent. We now know that those who were lucky enough in places where they could start experimenting with cereal cultivation were far more lucky, and because they had far more productivity, than those who were experimenting with tubers, yams, and bananas in the Pacific Islands, for example. They probably started experimenting this even earlier than the Mesopotamians, but we know that that did not lead on to a urban civilization. Now this, so those who did take to cereal cultivation, as those in India, Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, what they saw was that their population started increasing once very fast once they settled, and those large population explosions resulted in mass migrations. So this is the second class of prehistoric migrations, and that impacted all over the world. The third major class of prehistoric migrations happened after modern humans mastered the art of metallurgy, learned how to make bronze and to use that to make weapons, and also, importantly, domesticated horses well enough to use them for mobility and war. This set of migrations also affected a large part of the world, especially in Eurasia, from the farthest reaches of Europe to West Asia to South Asia to even China. We could perhaps tentatively call them Bronze Age migrations. These three classes of migrations happened that I just described happened by and large in the prehistoric period or before writing had become common practice in most parts of the world. But the fourth major migration class of migrations happened, driven by historic forces, happened in the last few centuries, and this happened when modern humans figured out how to cross the oceans and invented steamships that helped them sail around the world quickly and make colonies. And this was also global in its impact and changed the demography in some parts of the world in a major manner and in other parts in a minor manner. In India, our demography has been impacted or shaped by three of the four migrations. The last one did not leave a major impact on us because the number of migrants was too small compared to the existing population. It would be interesting to watch today, think whether future historians will say today that we are going through a fourth major migration today, driven by differential growths in population and perhaps GDP, but it's too early to say whether that is happening now. So in a sense, if we want to really understand India's demography as it stands today, we need to grasp the nature of the three classes of major prehistoric migrations that reached India and what happened after they arrived. It requires no real expertise to say that India is, Indian population is a mixture of various ethnicities. You only have to go into any metropolitan city in India to understand that. But what we did not know until very recently in the last few years is, but how did that come about and over what time periods? In other words, who are we Indians and how did we come to be? Before I try to answer that question, I need to speak a little bit about the prehistory of this project, of the early Indians project itself, because that will help us understand why it became possible to answer this question now and not earlier. When I started on this project 6 years ago, as Professor Majumdar said, the question on my mind was not who we are Indians, but who were the Harappans. The Harappans had been a fascination for me ever since I learned about it in school. And it always intrigued me that three questions had never been answered. Who were the Harappans? Where did they go? And why did it take more than 1,000 years for cities and urbanism itself to rise up in India again? So I started by visiting all the major Harappan sites in India, like Dholavira and Lothal in Gujarat, Rakhigadi in Haryana. And I would follow that up with meetings and long discussions with the historians, archaeologists, epigraphists, philologists, linguists, who all had either worked on those sites, written papers, or had worked on the Harappan civilization itself. Those are very fascinating conversations and answered a lot of my questions, but left me with even more questions. And at the first, you realize that you really can't answer who the Harappans were unless you can answer who were the first farmers of India, because it was clear that the Harappan civilization clearly rose out of the agricultural revolution that had happened in the northwestern part of India. You can see the farming happening in the archaeological record. You can see the villages forming, walled villages, walled cities, and the entire civilization. It's a natural. So you can't. The answer to the question who were the Harappans is the same as who were the first farmers of India. But you can't really answer who were the first farmers of India unless you answered who were the first Indians. So that's how we arrived at the scope of the work expanded over a period of 1.5 years to much larger than what it started with. And sometime during this period, I also realized around 2014 that a lot of the actually new interesting information was coming from a new field called population genetics that I've been aware of, but not very, very closely following. I remember reading Professor Majumdar's papers in particular, which are one of the first, if not the first, to say that the Indian population was formed by an admixture of 4 or 5 ancient populations. So these were complete revelations because these were not things that you would see in that way elsewhere. But most of the research then, or even later, was not focused on the entire population, was more focused on even in population genetics, the North Indian and South Indian population, especially the Aryan migration. Not that these were not useful. In 2009 came out a report that was by the Center for Cellular and Molecular Biology, Hyderabad, scientists from there, and Harvard University, which said, based on DNA analysis, that the North Indian populations were more closely related to West Eurasians and the South Indians. This was interesting, but this could not really solve the problem of the definite conclusion about our origins. This changed a few years later when geneticists finally acquired the ability to extract ancient DNA or DNA from people who lived thousands or even tens of thousands of years ago. I will explain why. Until it became possible to extract and sequence DNA from ancient individuals, population genetic studies were based on analyzing currently living populations. And such analysis can help you understand which populations are connected to which other populations, and to what extent. For example, like the study that I mentioned, it mentioned that the North Indians were more closely connected to West Eurasians than South Indians, but it can't solve the problem of how did that relationship come about? Did the Indians go to West Eurasia? Did the West Eurasians come to India? It can't solve that problem. Population geneticists did try, however, their best to answer this question of direction of movement by looking at the distribution of haplogroups. That is, haplogroups are branches in the global human family tree that identify lines of descent either through the maternal line or through the paternal line. There's only a little bit, small part of the DNA that we acquire, that we inherit in this manner, exclusively without mixing or recombining from just one of our parents. Most of the DNA that we inherit comes in a recombined manner from both of our parents, and that makes it difficult to work out a family tree from there. But this bit of DNA that comes exclusively from the father or mother and without change, except for mutations that happen along the way, allows you to work out a family tree that can go back to tens of thousands of years ago, especially because of the mutations, because you can see how it branches. Then, by looking at existing genomic data from around the world, we can also figure out how these haplogroups are distributed around the world. Right? So you can almost say that if this is the haplogroup you belong to, this is the group that you belong to, is distributed around the world. Then population geneticists can usually use at least 2 indicators to arrive at the tentative conclusion about who moved from where. Let's say that there is a haplogroup B is seen in both in Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh. Let us also say that the data suggests that the frequency of haplogroup B is much higher in Andhra Pradesh than in Karnataka, in the sense that the presence of haplogroup B in that population is much higher. Let's also say that the variance within that haplogroup, that's differences within that haplogroup, is also higher, much higher in Andhra Pradesh than in Karnataka. Then you could perhaps arrive at a conclusion that haplogroup B spread from Andhra Pradesh to Karnataka rather than the other way around, because all indications are that haplogroup B was older in Andhra Pradesh than in Karnataka. Though this looks sensible, the problem is that there's a problem with it. The problem is that present day distributions of haplogroups are no indicator of how they were distributed in the past. There might have been a invasion, or there might have been an epidemic or some other calamity that reduced the population of haplogroup B in Karnataka, and therefore its variance and frequency reduced. So therefore you can't arrive at the conclusion that haplogroup B spread from there to here. So this is where ancient DNA solved that problem. Now imagine, for example, that from Bangalore you have an archaeological site and you have recovered DNA from different time periods. And let's say that from the time period of 3000 BCE, arbitrarily, there is no sign from the DNA that was recovered from 3000 BCE in Bangalore. There's no sign of a Central Asian ancestry. Let's also say that you recovered ancient DNA from 2000 BCE in Bangalore, and you do find a Central Asian ancestry. It's a clear conclusion then that between 2000 BCE and 3000 BCE and 2000 BCE, there is a new ancestry that came into Bangalore. And this has revolutionized our understanding of prehistory around the world. And in a very significant manner, and in a manner which has overthrown many existing assumptions. We now know, for example, that today Europe went through at least two major churns, population churns, in just the last 10,000 years. At first, farmers from Anatolia, or today's Turkey, moved into Europe, either replacing or mixing with, mostly replacing, and to some extent mixing with earlier hunter-gatherers of Europe. So that's the first major demographic change in the last 10,000 years. Then again, around 5,000 years ago, pastoralists from East Europe or Central Asia moved into Europe, replacing or to some extent mixing with then existing farmers and also the remaining hunter-gatherers. So Europe is formed just in the last significant change in their ancestry and population structure in just the last 10,000 years. We know that in the Americas were populated by at least 3 migrations from Asia through Siberia and the Bering Straits around 16,000 years ago. This is long before any European set foot in the Americas. We now know that the East Asian populations were significantly changed, at least twice over, by migrations that originally began from the Chinese agricultural heartland. Again, an agricultural-led, population explosion-led migration that changed demography all across Southeast Asia, and as we will see, reached India too. So this is the revolution that ancient DNA has brought to our understanding of prehistory around the world. There's one more thing that we need to bear in mind as we move into the 4 prehistoric migrations that are relevant to India in particular, which I will go into in detail later, but this is just the 4 migrations that are relevant to India. Out of Africa migrations, of course. Agriculturists from West Asia or from the Zagros region of Iran, which would be on the borders of eastern borders of what's called the Fertile Crescent region. Again, agriculturists. So we were affected by two class 2 migrations, that is Neolithic migrations from East Asia about 4,000 years ago. Pastoralists from Central Asia around, these are the 4 which we'll go into in detail later. But it's good to keep in mind that while it is true that recent advances in population genetics have served to bring many ongoing debates to a conclusion, or have shone much more light on many of those debates than we had earlier, what is remarkable is that these findings are also in harmony with findings from other fields such as archaeology and linguistics, as we will see now. We will be using findings from 6 fields: history, archaeology, genetics, linguistics, philology, and epigraphy, which is the study of old scripts and seals and so on, to arrive at the conclusions that we are arriving at. And it is this interdisciplinary approach that gives us real insight into what happened in the past. So now we turn to the 4 specific migrations that shaped the Indian population as it is now. The book calls the people, the modern humans, who reached India, the first Indians. But when did they reach India? We know that they got, from genetics, we know that they moved out of Africa around 70,000 years ago. But when did they reach India? We do not have really old fossils of modern humans from India itself. The oldest would be about 28,000 years or so, too recent. But we do have fossils from other regions. Sri Lanka, I understand that the discovery of fossils now dates back to almost 50,000 years ago. And we know that they reached, modern humans reached East Asia at least by 63,000 years ago, and Australia by at least 59,000 years ago. So, and since they would have gone through, the scholarly consensus is that they would have gone through South Asia. It's a reasonable conclusion that by around 65,000 years ago, they were in India. And but what kind of a country did they come into? Did they come into an almost empty land with no immediate competition, like when the modern humans reached the Americas or the Australias or Australia? No, that we know for sure. They came into a land which is already robustly populated by archaic humans or other Homo species who are our evolutionary cousins. The earliest, even though we have only one actual fossil, a skull cap, recovered from Narmada Valley around 265,000 years ago, which we have not yet determined which Homo species it belongs to. There are lots and lots of stone tools that have been left behind, especially in peninsular India and central India, that clearly shows that we had a very robust population of other Homo species when the modern humans arrived. The earliest stone tools that have been recovered from Athiram in Tamil Nadu goes back to 1.5 million years ago. So that's how long they have been here. So when they came into India, it is clear, it's reasonable to say that they were stymied by a very robust population of archaic humans who went extinct a long time ago. This is Bhimbetka. If you haven't been to it, it's a fantastic place to visit. And this is one of the rock shelters. This has been in continuous use for almost 100,000 years, which means that it was used even much before humans arrived here, and it was used by other Homo species. So archaeologists say that when the modern humans arrived in India, they may not. It's unlikely that they occupied the whole of the country, obviously, because of where they found and the position they found themselves. We often think that the modern humans are far more advanced, and when something suddenly dramatically changed when modern humans arrived on the scene. But this is untrue. We are not very different from our evolutionary cousins. Some of them had even larger brains than us, and it's impossible to distinguish the kind of stone tools that were made by us and our evolutionary cousins for a very long period of time. So for most of their existence together, they were very much similar, and so it is likely, archaeologists say, that the modern humans who arrived in India did not spread over the entire continent, especially not into peninsular and central India, which would have been that we know where the other Homo species were much more robustly in presence. But they might have taken a sub-Himalayan route across into East Asia. It's also possible that another branch took a coastal route down through the west coast and then up through the east coast and then on to East India. But by which time would they have been in a position to say that they are in dominant position over the entire subcontinent? We have a rough idea, and that might be around 35,000 years ago. What makes you say that around 35,000 years ago they were in a controlling position or in a dominant position? In the three things happened. Around 35,000 years ago, the climate starts slowly deteriorating as it moves closer to the glacial period. More importantly, we start seeing more evidence of a new kind of tools that modern humans had invented, which are microlithic tools, which are really a few centimeters long, which are usually hafted onto bones or wood and used as spears, arrows, and things like that. It's a new kind of weapon, and which modern humans had. So we see increasing presence of modern human microlithic tools across the country. Begin to see. And geneticists say that around that period, there is a significant population expansion that's happening as well. If you put all of these things together, a reasonable thing to assume or to think is that as the climate starts deteriorating, modern humans start depending more and more on their newfound new techniques, and they start moving into areas they had avoided earlier as competition for habitable areas becomes tougher, and they are successful and their population increases. Geneticists, the scientists today say that by around 20,000 years ago, it's likely that India was the center of the modern human population. So our record as one of the largest population centers of South Asia's record as the largest population is nothing new. It goes back at least 20,000 years ago. This land has been very good, not just to all Homo species, we could say. Before I move on to the first farmers or the Harappans, just keep in mind, about 30,000 years after they arrived, they are likely in a dominant position in the country. And obviously, sometime along this path, all of the other Homo species went extinct. And by around, so it took them 30,000 years to be in a dominant position. And when does the next major migration happen? That happens around, as we will see, around 9,000 years ago. So remember that from 35,000 years ago to 9,000 years ago, the first Indians, the first modern humans in India, had a lot of time to spread out and be in all habitable regions of the subcontinent that they found themselves in. Now we move on to the Harappans. As we discussed earlier, Harappans or first farmers, the answer to both the questions are the same. The original question that fascinated me or started on this project. We know from extensive archaeological investigations that the northwestern region of India, that the Harappan civilization was a natural outgrowth of the agricultural revolution that took place thousands of years earlier. The earliest evidence of agriculture in the Indian subcontinent comes from a place called Mehergarh in Balochistan, in today's Pakistan. And that dates to around 7,000 BCE or 9,000 years ago. This is when we start to see evidence of the first wheat and barley cultivation, along with domesticated animals, especially goats. Another place called Lahurudeva in Upper Ganga Plain in today's Uttar Pradesh also shows evidence of rice harvesting, but we don't know whether the wild rice harvesting actually moved on to rice cultivation or when it did. But in any case, we know that it did not lead to a rice-based civilization in the Upper Ganga Valley at this point of time. But we know that the wheat and barley-based civilization of northwestern India did lead on to the largest civilization of its time in the world. When the Harappan civilization got going, it was as large as the Egyptian and Mesopotamian civilizations put together, both in terms of region and in terms of population. Its region was around 1 million square kilometers, which is about one third the size of India that we are living in. Imagine what it would have taken to knit together such a large area without any of the modern conveniences of transport, communication, and still have nearly standardized ways of building, of bricks, of construction, of seals, of weights and measures. How do we know? So, who are these people? Where did they come from? I think uh, the genetic, again, here also it is the ancient DNA that has come to solve the problem. And genetic studies based on ancient DNA recovered from the mature Harappan period, that is from 2600 BCE to 1900 BCE in the surrounding, in the Indus periphery region, has answered the question of what was the genetic composition of the Harappans. They were an admixed population of first Indians and West Asian agriculturals from the Zagros mountain region of what is today Iran, or on the, which is on the eastern borders of what is known as the Fertile Crescent, which was probably one of the earliest regions in the, which was the earliest, one of the earliest regions in the world to experience the agricultural revolution. The stunning thing is, much before this genetic evidence came about, and we know about it, archaeological studies done in Mehergarh in the 1980s provides already suggested much the same, but without going that far. According to Jean-François Jarich, which is the French archaeologist who led the excavations in Mehergarh, there are strong similarities between the archaeological findings of Mehergarh and those from the Zagros region from sites such as Ganj Dare and Alikhosh. Remember that Ganj Dare and Alikhosh are archaeological sites. Jarich is comparing those with what's happening in Mehergarh, and Ganj Dare and Alikhosh are the sites from where the DNA, ancient DNA was collected, which said this is the connection between the regions. Now, to quote Jarich, the archaeologist, the full setting of the farming economy of Mehergarh displays evident similarities with what has been noticed in the case of the early Neolithic settlements in the hilly regions forming the eastern border of Mesopotamia, which is the same as the Zagros region. What exactly are those similarities that Jarich talked about? Here are some. Same kind of houses built with the same kind of narrow bricks, about 60 it's more very specific, about 60 centimeters long, with similar finger marks for keying in the mortar, circular fire pits with burnt bricks, burnt pebbles, which are used to cook bread, which is the way that bread is cooked in Balochistan even today. Red paint on the walls of structures, the way skeletons were positioned in burials, baskets coated with bitumen, oblong-shaped cakes of red ochre. The list is indeed very, very long. Jarich, in fact, uses the phrase cultural continuum to describe the relationship between the two regions. So it's by putting both the genetic evidence and the archaeological evidence, the conclusion is unavoidable that it was a mixed population of first Indians and West Asians from the Zagros region who spread the agricultural revolution in northwestern India. So now we finally have an answer to who the Harappans were. The question whether the West Asians brought agriculture with them has to remain open, because as we said, modern humans in many regions were already experimenting with agriculture. Even in India, first Indians were experimenting with rice harvesting in Lahore Deva in the Upper Ganga plain. So it's likely that they were already experimenting with things in Mehergarh, and the arrival of Zagros people may have spread or catalyzed further development, because we already know that while wheat, barley, and goats are likely to have come from West Asia, there are strong domestications important to the economy that were done in India. The buffalo was domesticated in India. The zebu cattle were domesticated in India. Both are very important to the economy. So it is clear that there were strong local underpinnings to the agricultural revolution that took place in northwestern India. So the most reasonable story that we can tell is one of an agricultural revolution happening in northwestern India beginning from around 9,000 years ago, spearheaded by a mixed population of first Indians and West Asians, and then they go on to create the world's largest civilization of its time. My book talks about the Harappan Civilization at length. It's one of my most, the parts that I really enjoyed writing about, but for the purpose of this talk, I will leave that out. You have to read the book. Linguistics also supports the conclusion that we arrived at through genetics and archaeology, that there was a migration from the Zagros region to northwestern India. And this is equally fascinating, how this comes about. The earliest civilization or kingdom to arise in the Zagros region of Iran was called Elam. And that was sometime around 2700 BCE. The language that's spoken by its people, therefore, was called Elamite. It went extinct long time, centuries ago, millennia ago. But you see, we know that genetics and archaeology suggest that people from the Zagros region came to reached northwestern India around 7,000 years ago. That's when the agricultural revolution begins. So long before the first Elamite kingdom arose. So the people who came are unlikely to have been the urban products of Elam. They are obviously not. They are pre-urban, pre-Elam kingdom itself. But it is likely that a spoken language that is pre-Elamite or proto-Elamite. Now, if they brought a proto-Elamite language with them, it could have become one of the dominant languages of the Harappan region. And if it was, that language must have left a mark. It's a civilization in its mature phase around lasted for 700 years, and then people, as we will see, spread all around. So it must have left a mark. Is there such a mark? Yes, there is. Now, this is fascinating. Long before the Harappan civilization anybody knew that there is such a thing as the Harappan civilization, because it was discovered only in the 1920s. Linguists working on Dravidian languages were suggesting a connection between Elamite and Dravidian. This is long before anybody knew there is such a thing as Harappan civilization. The Harappan civilization, Edwin Norris, the first guy to suggest this was Edwin Norris in 1853. He is one of the scholars who helped decipher the well-known Behistun inscription of the Achaemenid emperor Darius. He pointed out that the Elamite script worked on the same principles as Tamil. In 1856, Robert Caldwell, who wrote the first grammar of the Dravidian family of languages, put forward Elamite as the first suggested affiliation for Tamil and discussed the connection between the two at length. But the real and substantive work on this was done much later, one done by linguist David W. McAlpin. I spent hours talking to him. He's very old now. He's in the US. And who wrote a very impactful paper in 1981 titled Proto-Elamo-Dravidian, the Evidence and Its Implications. McAlpin and another very well-known linguist who is an expert in both Dravidian languages and Indo-European languages, Professor Franklin C. Southworth, co-authored a paper in 2013. That's very recent. And remember, and this is still before the latest genetic findings that link the two regions, that took these arguments forward, and it was titled South Asia, Dravidian Linguistic History, and concluded that older Elamite resembles Proto-Dravidian. This is what they said in their paper. Thus, we may posit as a starting point that the Proto-Dravidian community probably moved from somewhere in the south of present-day Iran. What is noteworthy is that this paper came out full 5 years before the new ancient DNA evidence emerged. Again, my book goes into details of why do they say that there are similarities between Proto-Dravidian and Elamite, and gives word and other similarities. So what we are seeing is that three very different disciplines, archaeology, genetics, and linguistics, arrive at the same conclusion independently, not based on each other. They don't even know what the other discipline is doing. So even though the Harappan script has not yet been deciphered, the interlocking evidence of archaeology, linguistics, and genetics suggests a Proto-Dravidian language was spoken in the Harappan civilization. There is also another what I found to be a very striking piece of evidence that suggests this link. Archaeologists have long known that there are very strong links between the Mesopotamian civilization and the Harappan civilization, though both arose independently. There were strong trade links and they influenced each other. In fact, the archaeological accounts of Mesopotamia show evidence of the trade links between the West Asian civilization and the Harappans. It is also known that one of the things that Mesopotamia got from the Harappans was sesame. And the striking finding is that the word for sesame in Dravidian languages and in the then language of Mesopotamia, which is Akkadian, is the same, Ellu. So sesame went from the Harappans, this is already acknowledged, and the name for sesame in Dravidian and in the then language of Mesopotamia, which is Akkadian, is the same, is Ellu. So this is the second large prehistoric migration that contributed to shaping the Indian population, and it came from West Asia around 9,000 years ago, and it's part of the Neolithic and agriculture-related migrations that we talk about first that impacted all of the world. Now we move on to the third migration. These are just Harappan cities, that's Mohenjo-daro, Tholabira. I mean, we can't go to Mohenjo-daro. They won't give us the visa. But if you haven't been to Tholabira, it's an amazing site to visit. So, as we said, the Harappans or the West Asians were the first agriculture-related, but they were not the only ones. There were one more major agriculture-related, but this time from the east, from migrations that began in the agricultural heartland of China after China went through an agricultural revolution. And there were two migrations from China that affected the rest of the. When you say migrations, you should remember, I mean, this as well as earlier migrations, we are often talking in terms of large periods of time. So when you're talking about, it's not the same people, it's the same people and their descendants, they might have mixed along the way. So you have to see it as a process happening over time. So there were two migrations from China that happened. One that took the land route. These were people speaking what's called Austro-Asiatic languages. And they came across the land route and they finally, this has been proven by ancient DNA research of the migration and how it changed the demography of all of Southeast Asia. And they reached India sometime after 4,000 years ago or 2000 BCE. There was also another migration that started in China, but that took the island route and they spoke Austro-Asian languages and it went across to Pacific Islands, Philippines, etc. But that did not touch India. The Austro-Asiatic languages that came to India are now spoken by tribals in central India and eastern India, and these languages are part of the family of, are linked to the Mon Khmer family, which is spoken in Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, etc. So this connection has now been proven by both ancient DNA as well as genetic other current living DNA studies that have been done. So that's the third major migration. They probably brought new farming practices with them and new plants, so that's the third larger migration. Now we come to the last migrants, and I want to make an observation. My book talks about 4 migrations, but nobody has a problem with any of the 3. Nobody bothers that the first Asians came from out of Africa, or the Dravidian languages may have come from West Asia, or that the Munda and Khasi, the tribals, they came from East Asia. Nobody really bothers. But the moment you talk about the idea of migration, there is a whole lot of sensitivity, which made me wonder, why is there a particular sensitivity about one migration and not the rest? And I think this is based on 2 misperceptions. One misperception is that the Indian culture is essentially Aryan, Sanskrit, Vedic, and if you say that came from through a migration, then you're saying all of our culture is arose from elsewhere. This is wrong on 2 counts. First of all, it is wrong to say that Indian culture essentially flows from Aryan, Vedic, Sanskrit culture. There is the first major civilization that happened, the largest one in the world of its time, is the Harappan Civilization, and that precedes the arrival of the steppe migration. And they have left a large mark on our history and our culture. Today, the way that we build houses, for example, with around a courtyard, that comes from the Harappan civilization. Many of the cooking utensils you still use, their shape, you will see where it comes from. The people tree and the sacredness of it, that you will see very clearly. And there are lots and lots of, my book talks about all of them. So there's a large imprint of the Harappan civilization that the Indian culture today draws from. So it is not correct to see Indian civilization as our culture is a confluence of multiple factors. This is one. The second point is that even if you said that steppe migration brought in an early version of Sanskrit, it doesn't by any stretch of imagination mean that Sanskrit or the Vedas were brought from elsewhere. Both of them are the result of mingling, of mixing between the migrants and the people who are already settled here. And it is very clear from the Sanskrit itself. The earliest Sanskrit that we know, which is the earliest Sanskrit that we know is the Rigvedic Sanskrit, already has retroflexed consonants, which most of the Indo-European languages do not have. These are ta, na, da. All these are a strong part of the pre-Aryan languages, especially Dravidian languages. So it is clear that even in the earliest version of the Sanskrit, we see influence of the mixing that has happened between cultures. So there is no. So this is one part. Now, how do we know that there was a migration from the Central Asian steppe? As usual, recent genetic research based on ancient DNA has provided the finishing touch, but these research findings tally well with earlier research based on DNA of currently living populations, as well as research in other disciplines, particularly linguistics. For example, it's well known that the Indo-European languages are the largest family of languages in the world, and they are spread from Iceland in the west at one end to India at the other end. And there is no large community of population to the east of India that speaks Indo-European languages. 40% of the world's population today speaks an Indo-European language, such as English, Hindi, Spanish, Portuguese, Iranian, Russian, German. 2/3 of the Indians speak an Indo-European language, from Hindi to Bengali to Punjabi to Marathi. The Indian subcontinent forms the easternmost limit of the Indo-European family language range. There are no large populations in the east of India. So we need to have an explanation for how did this language come to be distributed, language family come to be distributed in this way around the world. And the same logic applies. So there are only two answers. Either it went from here to the rest of the world, or it came from elsewhere into this part of the world. And this applies not just to India, to any country that is speaking English. If you ask how did you come to have this language, it either spread from here or it came there. Now, if the language did spread from India to the rest of the world, then one would expect to see a fair sprinkling of the genetic signature of the first Indians all the way from India to Eastern Europe, to Western Europe and Iceland. But is there such a signature? No. The first Indian ancestry today has no close relatives anywhere in the world except in South Asia. South Asia is the only place you will find them. And that's because people who left from here long ago, 60,000, 65,000 years ago, you can no longer call them close relatives. But there is one exception to this rule of saying South Asia is the only place where you can find first Indian ancestry, and that is an exception that proves the point. The Roma, earlier called the Gypsies, a relatively small itinerant group that lives mostly in Europe and increasingly also the Americas, who were earlier known as Gypsies. Genetic studies have confirmed that they have come from a single ethnic group that left northwestern India the regions of Punjab, Sindh, Rajasthan, and Haryana some 1,500 years ago, long after the Indo-European languages became established in Europe and elsewhere, but a long time ago still, nonetheless. So, as they migrated west, did the Roma carry the genetic signature of the first Indians? Yes, they did. The Roma carry mitochondrial haplogroups that are distinctively identified with the first Indian ancestry in South Asia. In other words, when there was actually a migration of people from Indian subcontinent towards the west and all the way to Europe, genetic signature of the first Indians went with them. That there is no other evidence of such a signature is a strong suggestion that Indo-European languages were not spread from India to the rest of the world. But this circumstantial evidence was given a boost last year with a new paper co-authored by 92 scientists from around the world and using ancient DNA from Central Asia and South Asia arrived at robust conclusions. The study said until around 2100 BCE, there is no evidence of a Central Asian steppe ancestry in the Indus periphery or the region surrounding it, including Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, a well-known civilization that the Harappans were in regular contact with. But after that period, we begin to see evidence of such ancestry in these regions. The study said that there was a southward migration of pastoralists from the Kazakh steppe first towards southern Central Asian regions such as Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan after 2100 BCE, and then towards South Asia through the second millennium. The study that details the steppe migrations into India also measures in well with earlier studies, which we have already seen, of suggesting steppe migrations into Europe that changed the demography of Europe about 1000 years before they reached India. The steppe migrations into Europe happened 3000 BCE. The steppe migration in South Asia happens around 2000 BCE. There's a 1000-year difference with them. And this gives you the reason why Indo-European languages are spread the way they are from Iceland in the west to India in the easternmost. So this completes the 4 prehistoric migrations that brought in the major components that form the Indian population today. There's a never-ending series of other migrations that streamed into India in the historic period, but we know today that none of them left a major mark on our demography. Though some of them did contribute to a culture significantly. From the Huns, the Sakas, or the Scythians, the Greeks, the Arabs, the Persians, the Siddhis, the Jews, the Persians, the Syrians. It's a long list. But as the book says, we are all Indians and we are all migrants. But the story of our demography and population structure does not end with the arrival of the migrants. It only begins with it. What happened after they arrived? And how did we get to have the current regional, linguistic, and ethnic composition that we have today? We need 2 keys to answer that question. The first is what happened during the 2000 years between 2000 BCE and the beginning of the Common Era. The second will open the door to what happened during the 2000 years after the beginning of the Common Era to now. These are 2 distinct periods in terms of understanding our demography, as we will see. Let's try and imagine the first period from 2000 BCE to 1000 BCE, to the beginning of the Common Era, 2000 years. If anyone were to ask you what's the most tumultuous period in the history of South Asia, there should be zero doubt what that period is. It is this period. Imagine all that happened. A civilization that had sprung up over thousands of years and in its mature phase alone lasted 700 years, the largest civilization in the world of its time, fell apart because of a long drought around 2000 BCE. People who built that civilization, who lived in that civilization, moved to the east, North India, and to South India. As the civilization declined, the cities began to crumble into ruin. And then come new migrants from East Asia, bringing new ways, new languages, new practices. And then comes newer migrants from Central Asia, bringing another new language and new practices, mastery over metallurgy, horses, much greater mobility, and they're dominant enough in North India to make shift, to have a language shift from pre-Aryan languages to Aryan languages in Northern India. So you cannot find a more tumultuous period of change and turmoil and churn than these 2000 years. And genetics says that during this 2000 years, India saw the kind of population mixing that it has not experienced either before or after. So much so that it's difficult to find any large population group anywhere in the country, no matter how remote a region, that does not display some effect of the genetic mixing that happened. The only people that you can say were left out of this mixing were people in the Andamans, because they were obviously physically cut off from the mainland. So that's the level of mixing that happened during the 2000 years that followed. So you have to remember, around 2000 years ago, all the four major components are in. All the four major components of Indian demography are in. And for the next 2000 years, there's significant mixing that happens between those two population components. Now, we move to the next stage. So what happened in the next stage? What happened in the next 2000 years from the Common Era? Genetic research says that 2000-year period of mixing came to an end somewhere around 100 CE, when endogamy, or the practice of people marrying within their groups, took hold. Since endogamy is the distinguishing mark of the caste system, we can surmise that this is the time around when the caste system became the practice in Indian society. In other words, the common assumption that the caste system began with the arrival of the step of the Arya is wrong. It did not begin with the arrival of Arya. It began almost 2000, as a common practice, it began almost 2000 years later. My book suggests that one way of grasping this information is look at the caste system not as a religious development, but as a political development that happened around 100 CE. The idea of endogamy or racial purity may have been present among a small subset of the Indian population before 100 CE, but after that period, that sentiment or approach to life that was became the dominant social practice. We do not know what precise political developments led to this, though my book offers some pointers. Now, the practice of endogamy or caste system that has been in effect for 2000 years has left a major mark on Indian society and its demography and its population structure, says genetic research. For example, genetic difference between people in the same village is 2 to 3 times higher than the genetic difference between North Europeans and South Europeans. So the system has increased differences between people. To quote genetic scientist David Reich, people tend to think India with its more than 1.3 billion people as having a tremendously large population, and indeed many Indians as well as foreigners see it this way. But genetically, this is an incorrect way. The Han Chinese are truly a large population because they have been mixing freely for thousands of years. In contrast, there are few, if any, Indian groups that are demographically very large. The truth is that India is composed of a very large number of small populations. Now, so this is one way to look at and understand the Indian population structure. 4 prehistoric migrations that brought the main moving parts or the main basic components of the Indian population. A 2000-year period of mixing that ensured that almost all population groups in the country are a combination of these 4 components in differing proportions, of course. And then a 2000-year period of genetic segregation or endogamy that has created a large number of small populations. There's also another visual method that would help us understand the structure perhaps better. The metaphor of the Indian demographic pizza, of all things, that I have used in my book for lack of anything better that I could think of. Where the base is the ancestry of the first Indians, the descendants of the original out of Africa migrants who reached here about 65,000 years ago. This is because we know from genetic studies that most Indian population groups, 50 to 65% of their ancestry comes from first Indians. This is new. Because we earlier used to ask, where did the first Indians go? Where can we find them? Do we have to go to Andamans? Now we know that we only have to look into the mirror or look outside anywhere. Because most Indian populations groups carry 50, very large, the largest ancestry that they carry is from the first Indians. On top of this base comes the source. And the source are the Harappans. Why? Because when the civilization declined, they spread across North India, South India, and everywhere, carrying the culture, the language, everything with them. And thus forming the glue that holds us together. Many things that we today see across the country, where should we see their origins? It would make sense to go look at the Harappan civilization, the glue that holds us together. They are the ancestors of both North Indians and South Indians. Not the usual story that we are told, but that's the source. And the Harappans took with them many of their cultural practices and belief systems that they had perfected in the crucible of the Harappan civilization. These have now become integrated into the lives and belief systems of Indians in both the North and the South. On top of the sauce, then comes the cheese and the toppings, and you can imagine who they are. These are the people who came in later. They are not spread uniformly across the country. There's more of it in some parts of the world, some parts of the country, and less in other parts. The cheese, the toppings, and the sauce can be found in other regions of the world too. The Central Asia, in East Asia and West Asia, but the base of the pizza is unique to the South Asians. You will not find another base like that anywhere else. That's because the first Asians have, as I said, no close relatives elsewhere. So that's about as much as we can say about the way our population is structured and distributed based on current findings. Very broadly, one can expect the eastern parts of the country to carry relatively more East Asian ancestry, northern and western parts of India to carry more West Eurasian ancestry, southern parts of India to carry comparatively, in a comparative sense, more first Indian ancestry. But what can be said of all is that we all carry mostly the first Indian ancestry, and that we are all migrants, and that we are all mixed. But what are the implications of this for us as Indians? In what way does it, or should it, change the way we see ourselves and each other? There are some things that this will. I don't think this is all of the implications can be foreseen today, because these are the clarity that the science has brought us, the kind of clarity that we did not have for a very, very long time. So I'm sure even the implications and understandings of what this tells us, it will take time to unfold, but this is a first attempt. We Indians are formed mostly out of four major prehistoric migrations: the first Indians, the West Asians, the East Asians, and the Arya. Our culture and our civilization reflects this mix. Most population groups in India today carry over 50% of their ancestry from the first Indians. And this is important, no matter where they live, what language they speak, or what caste they belong to. Remember that the first Indians had about 25,000, 26,000 years to spread out before the next major migrations came. The idea of Sanskrit Vedic culture is one of the important constituents of our civilization as it stands today, but it is not the only one or even the earliest one. The Harappan civilization precedes it by far. When their civilization declined, the Harappans spread both North India and South India, thus becoming the ancestors of both. The culture that spread in both regions is in many ways the glue that holds us together. This is also important. The tribals are not very different from us, from the rest of the, not us, from the rest of the Indian population, us in quotation marks. All the rest of the population shares the maximum genetic ancestry with the tribals. That's the process that we have. They are not different. The caste system did not originate with the arrival of the Arya. It fell in place almost 2000 years later. It has to be seen as a political development that had and has no real rational basis. And if something can come up through politics, it should be turned back through politics, can be turned back through politics as well. But the most important lesson of all of this is we are all migrants and we are all mixed. The genius of India is that it has created a unique, highly influential civilization out of the disparate streams that flowed into it at different times in our long history. The sources of our common culture, therefore, are many and not singular. One of the striking things is also that when we think about it, we live in a geographical region that can be termed a common civilizational and conversational area. The topics of our intellectual and cultural discussions, debates, and disputes are uniquely our own, but we do not have a consensual set of answers. Our answers and responses are dependent on the different traditions and historical experiences that different groups among us carry. We have, as Indians, have lived through the same history too, but sometimes from different ends. Any conception of our nationhood that doesn't take into account our unity in diversity will be doing a disservice to one of the greatest civilizations the world has seen. To try to erase our diversity in order to create a monoculture would be a typically un-Indian enterprise prone to mishaps and doomed to failure. I think the best example that we could draw of what this unity in diversity probably means is when the Buddhist missionaries first carried India's cultural ethos beyond its borders to China, Southeast Asia, and Central Asia. It was driven by a missionary zeal that is global and all-encompassing, without discrimination of caste, creed, or race. It's the first philosophy in the world to feel the urgent need to carry its message of compassion to everyone, without care for natural borders, man-made borders, race, breed, anything at all. It drew its principles and practices from all parts of India's previous history, including that of the Arya, even while challenging ritual, sacrificial practices and ideas of hierarchy. It was therefore natural that it became the first philosophy in the world that felt the burning desire to share its insights and message of compassion with all humans, without regard for man-made or natural borders. That Buddha's message still flourishes with 488 million adherents around the world today, trying to live up to the principles he enunciated, is testimony to the global appeal of a uniquely Indian philosophy rooted in the same soil from which the Upanishads grew, and true sustenance from the same principles. So that we have come to the end of what one can gainfully say about India's demography and population structure. I would end by saying that history and prehistory has a lot to teach us. If we listen carefully and with an open mind, the lesson that we will hear is that we are all Indians, we are all migrants, and we are all mixed. Thank you very much for listening.